The early 1980s witnessed perhaps the richest musical cocktail of the 20th century. Alongside plenty of pop-pap, there was a veritable profusion of musical styles, including the sound of post-punk championed by the likes of Public Image Limited and Gang of Four, the wonderful ska of the two-tone movement, epitomised in the incredibly inventive and era-defining Ghost Town by the Specials, the burgeoning new wave of British heavy metal, including acts such as Iron Maiden, Angel Witch and Saxon. Then, of course, there was the goth scene pioneered by the likes of Bauhaus, The Cure and the Sisters of Mercy. Punk, too, persisted in the form of the Spirit of 82 spearheaded by GBH, the Exploited and the Anti-Nowhere League. There was Oi, or street punk, alongside this as well. Add to this heady concoction the new romantic movement represented by the Human League and Adam and the Ants, and you begin to see quite how rich and diverse the musical tapestry of this golden age really was. Of course, we have not yet mentioned the rock and roll and rockabilly revivalism of this era. The former came in the form of Leicester's very own Showaddywaddy and Mud, alongside a young Elvis enthusiast from Ely and Cardiff by the name of Michael Barrett, who, as Shakin' Stevens would go on to become the biggest charting artist of the 1980s. Stevens had first come to prominence as the leader of Shakin' Stevens and the Sunsets, a band that, in the last part of the 1970s, released a slew of super albums that consisted chiefly of rock and roll and rockabilly cover versions. There was also Matchbox, who were remembered principally for their two hit singles, I'm a Rockabilly Rebel and Midnight Dynamos. It is also appropriate to note the work of American Robert Gordon in this conversation, who, working with the likes of Link Wray and Chris Spedding, did much to re-energise this somewhat flagging musical genre. Though perhaps the most significant act that introduced much of the rarer forms of rockabilly to the UK was another band hailing from South Wales by the name of Crazy Cavan and the Rhythm Rockers, a fantastic live act. Crazy Cavan Grogan would continue producing albums and performing until his very sad passing in 2020. Whilst the likes of Cavan and the Flying Saucers attracted a largely teddy boy audience, the early 80s also witnessed the birth of a new or Neo-Rockabilly movement with which this book is concerned. This scene, along with the Psychobilly scene that it would subsequently spawn, was largely ignored by the mainstream music press. The Big Three, Melody Maker, the NME, New Musical Express, and Sounds. I suspect that this owed something to the rather sniffy-nosed middle-class art school sensibilities of the media, as well as perhaps an aversion to the predominantly white working-class nature of these subgenres. It was a scene, however, that was quite significant in numbers, as attested to by the hundreds that would turn up on a weekly basis to rockabilly events at the Royalty in Southgate, and a little later to what would become the Mecca for Psychobillys, the club foot at the Clarendon Hotel in Hammersmith. Neo-Rockabilly was a newly energised form of the 1950s music that undoubtedly borrowed some of the youthful vim and vigour from the punk scene of the late 1970s, and frequently would also innovate musically, for example with the use of more inventive chord progressions, but at heart it remained quite true to the sounds of Gene Vincent that had inspired it. Psychobilly, however, injected a heavy influence of punk to the billy and shifted the focus of the songs away from pink Cadillacs and love stories towards a fascination with sci-fi, B-movies, the macabre, and all things sick. Quite who the originators of Psychobilly were remains an issue of some contention. A significant share of the vote would undoubtedly side with an American impetus coming in the form of the Cramps. Indeed, any serious analysis must lend credence to this thesis with even the most cursory listen to the band's debut album of 1980, Songs the Lord Taught Us, conforming to the themes outlined above. However, it was a London-based three-piece, The Meteors, that would pioneer the movement in a British setting. Led by the pugnacious figure of P. Paul Fenech from the band's inception in 1980 to the present, and never one to hide his light under a bushel, Fenech has declared op map, only the Meteors are pure Psychobilly. Putting aside such quibbles of nomenclature, it is obvious that Psychobilly as a genre does exist, and has continued to evolve through first, second, and arguably even a third wave. Notable along this path of evolution has been the increased influence of garage rock and heavy metal. I make no apology for my inclusion of albums from across the whole 40 plus years of the genre. In this brief reader into the worlds of Neo-Rockabilly and Psychobilly, I, frequently alongside those involved in the creation of these great albums, offer some analysis of some of the key albums from the scene. This just happens to be my favourite 40 albums from the scene at the time of writing. It is not a definitive list, and no doubt many will lament the exclusion of their favourite album. How can he possibly not include X? Or why on earth has he included Y? I can already hear you shout. But that is half the point. If this short book stimulates conversation about an oft-neglected scene, then it has succeeded in one of its principal aims. Its other key aim is simply to celebrate some classic albums. The book ought therefore to appeal both to the curious and uninitiated, as well as to the cognoscenti. I hope that you enjoy.